What is Paul's thorn in the flesh? Now, there are those who twist the meaning of Paul's thorn to preach against divine healing. They believe that Paul's thorn was a sickness, a disease of some sort, so that when he asked God to heal him, God said no, that my grace is sufficient. And from that interpretation, people say, well, you see, healing is not God's will all the time. And so sometimes God turns us down. Well, is that what Paul's thorn in the flesh was? It wasn't. Let me show you what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's read the passage, verse 7 through 10. To keep me from being conceited, because of the surpassing great revelation, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. First of all, the thorn in the flesh was because of the great revelations he's gotten. I've noticed most people who claim to have Paul's thorn in the flesh, they don't have Paul's revelation. They have rather a lot of ignorance on their part. But let's keep reading. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, watch this, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. Notice, he doesn't mention sickness or disease. That is not even on the list, friend. And the Greek word for sickness and disease is not found in Paul's description of what the thorn in the flesh did against him. He says, for when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So we know already Paul's thorn in the flesh was not a disease or a sickness, for he does not list them. So what is the thorn then in the flesh? Well, the Apostle Paul was quite familiar with the Old Testament. I mean, after all, he was a Jewish rabbi. He was even a Pharisee. So he was very familiar with the term thorn. And 3 times in the Old Testament, the term thorn is used. And in all 3 references, it refers to Israel's persecutors, those who troubled Israel. It was referring to people who were Israel's enemies, not to sickness and disease. Let me give you some passages. Numbers chapter 33, verse 55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. Does that sound familiar to the people who were persecuting Paul? They were thorns. I'll give you another passage in the Old Testament, Judges 2:3. Now, therefore, I tell you that I will not drive out before you. They will become thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. Again, what are thorns? It was the people, the enemies of Israel, not sickness and disease. And let me give you the final one where the term thorn is used. Joshua 23, verse 12 and 13. But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you will be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out those nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from the good land that the Lord has given you. It's clear that these thorns were, again, Israel's persecutors. Now you understand why the Apostle Paul asking the Lord to remove the thorn, because in these passages, God is telling them to remove these thorns in your sides. Remove these people. Even today, we have similar phrases that describe thorns. Like, have you ever said, that guy's a pain in the neck? And when you say he's a pain in the neck, does it really mean you have a pain in the neck? No, you even refer to pain in the neck to referring to people, don't you? So when Paul's asking the Lord to remove the thorn, he has biblical grounds because he feels like the enemies of God should be removed. But God is showing Paul, in this case, he has a purpose behind it. Because in the end, what happened is by Paul being thrown into prison, he had time to write the letters. We wouldn't even have the New Testament as we have it if it wasn't for Paul's imprisonments. So what Paul is learning from God is persecution is your lot in life. Don't be running from persecution. It makes you stronger in the end. So for those who say that Paul's thorn in the flesh was some eyeball disease or some sickness, there's nothing in the writings of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 to say it was, but rather the term thorns as used in the Old Testament always refers to persecutors of God's people, not to sickness and disease.